Please join me in giving Larry Reed a warm Pachyderm Club welcome.
Thank you, John. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I've heard so much about the Pachyderm Club for so long, and I know at least one of my colleagues has spoken to you recently, that I'm especially honored to be with you. I hope I sound better to you than I do to me. I have been traveling almost nonstop for the last 3 weeks to places like Alaska, Michigan, Washington, New York, Miami. And on one of those trips from New York down to Miami a week ago, I sat next on a plane to two people who spent most of the flight coughing and sneezing, and I thought, wonder what the chances are I'll pick this up, and sure enough I did. So I went in to see my doctor on Monday. He said, you're very sick, and I said, well, I want a second opinion, and he said, well, you're very ugly too. No, just kidding. But the worst of it's behind me anyway, so I hope I get through this without too much strain on your ears. What I'd like to do in the time we have is to, as John mentioned, mostly talk about this book. It's been out for a year, Excuse Me, Professor, Challenging the Myths of Progressivism. But I also, towards the end of my remarks, I want to give you a little taste of the newer book, Real Heroes, which I'm actually a bit more excited about simply because of its likely broader appeal across the country. And the fact that it's doing so well in just 2 days' time. It's 2 days ago on Amazon, when it was only released by hours, it was number 270,000 out of 8 million books. But as of this morning, it's number 700. So we just soared past 250,000 books in 2 days' time and headed hopefully for the top 100. Excuse Me, Professor is the title of a book that I worked on for about a year, intended primarily for college students, but really it appeals to people of any age. And the idea here was to give students in handy, easy to read format responses to as many of the major progressive myths and misconceptions that they hear often in college as possible. And so there are 52 chapters in the book. Each one is a different myth or misconception or cliche, with the response to it from a market-friendly free enterprise perspective. And of course I have my favorites, and history is my first love, so I thought I'd share with you a summary of at least a couple from the historical section of the book. One of the misconceptions that my guess is everybody here has heard at one time or another, maybe from teachers in high school or college, is that Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle, was a compelling indictment of the free market, that it made a case against the evil and greed of private profit-seeking entrepreneurs in the meatpacking business, and made a compelling case for government regulation. How many have heard at least that side of that case before? Well, I heard it too in the public high school that I went to. It was just sort of presented as if it were gospel, that the conditions in the meatpacking plants of Chicago at the turn of the last century were so awful that this wonderful man, Upton Sinclair, finally mustered the courage to investigate and write about it, and that led to the federal government coming in to put a stop to it with the passage of the Meat Inspection Act of 1906. And ever since, that episode is frequently presented as, the centerpiece of the case for government regulation. How can you possibly stand by while private entrepreneurs do such things as poison their customers? And that's eventually what I did too. The more I read, the more I realized that this was rather laughable, and yet it's presented as gospel. Well, as I point out in the book, the process of researching this led me to some interesting revelations. You know that the passages in Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle, that deal with alleged conditions in the Chicago meatpacking plants really comprise a very small portion of the book. And it was also, incidentally, a novel. This was not a documentary. He was paid $500 by the Socialist Party to write this. It was meant to be a tract that would provide a compelling case and drive people to the ideology of socialism. That was the whole purpose of it from the start. But the meatpacking plant conditions portion was really a very small part of the book. And in that portion, he makes reference to men falling into vats and being ground up with the sausage, and then the sausage being sold to the public. I know this is not particularly appetizing at lunchtime, but it's kind of hard to talk about this without at least mentioning that. Well, I thought to myself as I did the research on this, I thought, well, you know, whoever those people were that fell into those vats, they should be honored somewhere. I want to find out who they are. We should find out their names. Surely there are monuments to them somewhere. And if there were, they would be icons of the progressive left, right? You know, these people who gave their lives in these evil places in Chicago. We should honor their memory. So I tried and tried and tried to find who they were. Lo and behold, there were none. Never happened. There are no monuments. There are no names of people who fell into vats and were ground up into sausage. Never happened. Well, think about it. The first time you heard that, did it occur to you to wonder what people may have said at the time? If this really did happen, wouldn't somebody say, hey, what happened to Bob today? Or wouldn't somebody say, you know, Jim didn't come home from work today. What happened to him? But the progressive left just presents this stuff and we just swallow it as if, oh, well, they said it must have happened. It's in the book. So, but nobody, to my knowledge, I couldn't find anybody in all the decades since that actually tried to find out the names of any of these people. And so I finally gave up and said, well, there's no evidence that they existed, nothing in the newspapers of Chicago. There's just nothing. They don't exist. Well, that was commonplace throughout Upton Sinclair's book. It was not a documentary. The story is also presented quite often in the classroom that there was no meat inspection by any level of government before Upton Sinclair exposed these conditions. Well, another thing I discovered in doing the research, I went back into the congressional record of the day to see what the debates were like in Congress and what the hearings were like, who was saying what, who was presented to Congress as an expert on the issue. And lo and behold, I discovered that there was meat inspection. There was a congressman from the Midwest by the name from Indiana named Crumpacker. Unfortunate name for this subject maybe, but it was good for him. He was a very diligent guy, and he kept pressing in Congress. He kept saying, why are we talking about more government regulation here proposed in this Meat Inspection Act, when in fact we've had it at both federal and state levels. We've had inspectors in these plants for years. The question, he said, we ought to be asking is, if the conditions in those plants are anything like what Upton Sinclair suggested they would be, well then what about the government inspectors that were there? Were they asleep at the switch? Or were they bribed to keep quiet? I mean, either way, those need answered before we pile a new layer of regulation and inspection on top of what already exists. And yet, how many of you heard to this day that supposedly there was no regulation until the Meat Inspection Act of 1906? Yeah, that's the way it's presented. It was utter laissez-faire, and the private greedy capitalist meat packers had to be reined in by new regulation. Just wasn't the case at all. Now, you may have also learned from your history class that the meat packers themselves opposed the Meat Inspection Act of 1906. And that was the way it was presented to me, that, you know, why would they support it? They were the evil guys, and they were against this to the end until the people triumphed. Well, it turns out that they endorsed the bill and supported it. And you know why? Any ventures, any guesses that you'd like to venture as to why? What's that? Barrier to entry. They knew that this bill would produce a bureaucracy that they would more likely be able to control because it would be just a handful of people with official government stamps of approval on their product. And they knew that the cost of regulation would fall more heavily upon a newcomer or the smaller plants than the existing large companies with their political connections. They endorsed the bill. So But there's another more important reason. The inspection that took place before the passage of that act was paid for by the meat packers themselves. Okay? This bill took that monkey off their shoulder and said, the taxpayer will take care of that now. And so they thought, well, this is great. We get the official government stamp of approval, and the taxpayer will pick up the tab for the whole bureaucratic process. So it turned out that the actual fact was very different from the way it was presented to me in the classroom, and I think to millions of Americans. It's propaganda, the way it's typically presented. Well, that's one of the myths that we respond to in Excuse Me, Professor. Another one is in relation to the Great Depression. And this may be a topic you've addressed here at the Pachyderm Club, or perhaps, I think John, we may have even given copies to pass out here of an essay on the Great Depression. So forgive me if this is a bit of a repeat. But the misconceptions surrounding that painful episode in American history really cry out for rebuttal. So probably never hurts to repeat something you may have heard. Typically to this day, the Great Depression is presented in American classrooms as a debacle of capitalism. The free market. It was chugging along, having a great time in the 1920s. Government was an innocent bystander. And all of a sudden, the free market just fell apart of its own contradictions or greed or who knows what, fill in the blank epithet. And government then had to come in, particularly in the form of Franklin Roosevelt, to save us from the Great Depression. How many have heard some version of this episode like that in school? Still commonly presented, although I'm happy to say I think in recent years some of the gloss of that argument has been lost, and people are now hearing more frequently the actual truth. Well, it turns out that prior to the beginning of the Depression in 1929, we didn't have laissez-faire, tiny government. We had a decent fiscal policy under Harding and Coolidge in the 20s. In fact, they substantially brought down tax rates, which helped to grow the economy in a sustainable, productive, positive way. We had a great Treasury Secretary who's the subject of one of the chapters in the new Real Heroes book, Andrew Mellon, who was helping to cut those tax rates, cut the estate tax in half from 40 to 20%, the top income tax rate from 73 to 25%, and also by the late 20s, federal spending was no higher than it had been 6 or 7 years before. Those were positive things. But beneath the surface, you had from 1924 until late 28, some bad things happening. You had specifically a bad policy of easy money from the Federal Reserve, expanding money and credit at a feverish pace. The economist Murray Rothbard argues that figure is about 66% in terms of growth of money and credit over a 6 or 7 year period. That's a substantial increase in liquidity in the banking system. It was driving interest rates to a historic low by the late 20s. We had what we call the Roaring 20s, showing all the signs of a classic easy money fed boom in the economy, with one exception. Some people look at this period and say, but prices weren't rising. Where's the inflation? But inflation, of course, is not rising prices. That's one of the consequences of it. Prices may not rise, but they may be higher than they would otherwise have been because money and credit are being expanded. Or you could have offsetting factors such as an explosion in production, as we did in the 20s, thanks to things like those lower tax rates. But beneath the surface, you still had this inflation of money and credit driving interest rates to unsustainable lows. And in some markets, you did have rising prices. You had a soaring stock market. Much of the newly created money found its way there. You had a land boom in Florida. So the smart money saw what was happening. The Bernard Baruchs, the Joseph P. Kennedys, they saw what was happening. And they also saw when the Fed reversed itself and moved in the other direction. In late 28 and clearly by early 29, the Fed dramatically reversed itself from a policy of dramatic expansion of money and credit to what would result ultimately in a 3-year and very dramatic contraction of money and credit. After expanding it by 66%, from 1929 to 32, they will contract the money supply by 1/3. Now, that's not entirely by design. I think it got away from them. They really didn't set out to do that. But once it caught hold and bankruptcy soared and banks began to fail, things got really out of control. But it was Fed engineered through a series of policy mistakes and misjudgments from the get-go. This is not laissez-faire. This is not limited government. This is the government's central bank, fostering a bubble in the first place with its easy money and then trying to correct for it by moving too rapidly, too far in the other direction. There are people who say, well, once you have inflation, the answer to that is you have to have deflation. You have to reverse yourself, withdraw that money. But I'm of the school of thought that says, first of all, don't inflate in the first place, but if you've done that, you should stabilize as quickly as possible. Stop it, but don't try to contract the money supply. You're only going to make things even worse. It's like running over a man with a truck and then deciding to help him out, you're going to put it in reverse and back up over it. And that's exactly what happened to the economy. We got this inflation followed by deflation from the Federal Reserve System. That's not laissez-faire, that's not free market capitalism. But that's only the beginning of this episode. You know that by the spring of 1930, after the bubble had burst and the stock market had crashed, we didn't have a depression yet. The history books say, well, the depression began with the stock market's crash in October of 29. But by the spring of 1930, we only had 8.5% unemployment. That's not a depression yet, that's a recession. And the stock market had regained half of the ground it had lost in the previous fall. What happens to take a recession in 1930 and make it a depression? Well, on top of all the folly from the Fed, in the middle of 1930, you have President Hoover signing into law the Smoot-Hawley tariff, which raised tariffs to an all-time high, virtually closed the borders. The idea here was, well, if we have this nagging unemployment here at 8.5%, so if we just make foreign goods so expensive that Americans won't buy them, well, then they'll have to buy American-made goods, and that'll put those people back to work. But what they didn't understand in Washington, or were not willing to admit, is the fact that trade is ultimately a two-way street. You don't close the door to imports without closing the door to exports. If foreigners can't sell here because our tariffs are so high, how can they earn the dollars that they need to buy here? And being from Kansas, you probably know what industry in particular was hard hit by Smoot-Hawley because it had been selling 1/3 of its production in overseas markets. Now those markets are gone with the stroke of the presidential pen. I'm thinking of agriculture. Farmers had been selling 1/3 of what they produced in overseas markets. Now foreigners say, sorry, if we can't sell our stuff to you, so the boat's not coming, and if it ain't coming, we're not coming home with your soybeans. And this would have been bad enough. Smoot-Hawley by itself would have been bad enough, but it stimulated a worldwide trade war. Foreign governments said, all right, you're going to do that to our stuff, we're going to do it now to your stuff. And so tariffs went up across the board, all over the world. All of a sudden, a recession becomes a depression within a matter of months. Farmers walk off the farms in bankruptcy by the thousands. That drags down rural banks that held the mortgages on the farms. You look at bank failures from the late 20s, from 30, let's say, until the trough in 33. And you'll find bank failures typically were not in big cities, they were in rural areas among the smaller banks that held the farm mortgages. Well, then we have 1932. Full-scale depression on our hands. Here's the Fed contracting the money supply. You've got sky-high tariffs dragging world trade down dramatically. Guess what they do in 1932 to take a bad situation and make it worse? Raise taxes. In 1932, with the federal deficit going through the roof, which you have to expect when businesses are going bankrupt, people leaving the farm and becoming unemployed, they're not paying taxes, and Hoover unwilling to curtail spending. In fact, he's raising spending with his own bailout schemes and like the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. You've got this massive deficit, so they decide, let's do something about that. And rather than cut spending, they decide to double the income tax. Just what a depressed economy needs, right? So if you didn't already get flattened by Smoot-Hawley, now you really got it with a doubling of the income tax. The top rate was more than doubled, from 24 to 65% in one fell swoop. The same year, we got a presidential election. If you believed in small government and you thought big government was a part of the problem, which was the case, you would have voted for Franklin Roosevelt. Because Hoover had been meddling in the economy all over the place, raising taxes and tariffs, and Roosevelt campaigned on a platform against him, calling for the biggest reduction in federal spending proposed by any major party in American political history, any major political party. The Democratic Party platform of 1932 promised a 25% reduction in federal spending. Roosevelt attacked Hoover in these words more than once. He said, President Hoover is presiding over the greatest taxing and spending administration in American history. How's that square with what you learned in your history class about Hoover being the stand pat, do nothing, laissez-faire, non-interventionist president? Roosevelt didn't think that, and he was right. His running mate, John Nance Garner, assailed Hoover and said that Hoover was, quote, leading the country down the path to socialism. Well, so what happens in 32? Hoover goes down big time, Roosevelt's elected. We all think, oh, well, we're going to get the government out of a lot of this stuff that's making the situation worse. But of course, he had no intention of doing that and did almost nothing in that regard. But the only thing he did to get government off your back was within a year he ended prohibition, or supported the ending of prohibition. And you may have heard the old story about how things changed in 1 year's time. In the same year that we ended prohibition, Roosevelt seized your gold by executive order, and that was issued in April of 33, and you had within a month you had to turn in your gold under penalty of $10,000 in fines or 10 years in prison or both. But you could drink within a few months thereafter. And so you needed a drink after all this. And somebody once put it this way. They said, on January 1, 1933, if there were two men walking down the street, one of them with a gold coin in his pocket and the other with a bottle of whiskey in his hand, the one with the whiskey was the crook. The one with the gold coin was an honest citizen. A year later, it's just the opposite. The one with the gold coin is the crook because he didn't turn it in, and the one with the bottle of whiskey is having a great time and he's a perfectly legal citizen. That's how topsy-turvy the world became in such a short period of time. Well, I don't want to belabor this, but with FDR coming into office, you have a myriad of interventions in the form of sky-high tax rates. He attacked Hoover for raising income taxes to 64%. Before he's done, the top rate will be 94%. And there was a moment, in fact, when Roosevelt actually proposed a 100% income tax rate on all incomes over $25,000. In other words, if you made $26,000, you got a high rate on the first 25, and he wanted all of the other 1,000. He wanted everything beyond your first $25,000. How can people take risks and make investments in this kind of a climate? Fortunately, Congress overrode that. It never really took effect because they intervened and threw it out. If it had ever been challenged in court, I think it might have been thrown out. Not some of our courts today, maybe, but back then, because clearly it wasn't constitutional for the president to set tax rates unilaterally. I mean, that's what he tried to do, but that didn't happen. Then you had the Wagner Act, granting enormous new powers to labor unions in 1937, which led to a wave of strikes and lost man-hours of work and so forth. Militancy, rising costs of doing business, that was not helpful. We didn't really recover from the Great Depression through Roosevelt's economic policies. Some people say I think mistakenly, that it was the war that finally got us out of the Depression. I think that's not only in error, it's also fraught with a great danger. If you think that the road to prosperity is to just blow things up or declare war on somebody, it diverts resources. There's no question. War diverts resources. Instead of making refrigerators and automobiles and consumer goods, we were making guns, planes, and tanks, which arguably we had to win the war. But that's not the same as saying we're stimulating the economy. You look at unemployment rates and you might be led to believe that the war ended the Depression. But that's deceiving because we drafted 11 million men, sent them overseas, paid them in most cases less than they would have been paid if they'd had a job here at home. And in any event, they no longer counted in the unemployment figures. 11 million people out of the workforce. So the unemployment numbers look good. But anybody who lived through that period, I think, will tell you that general standards of living didn't really budge much during the 40s. If anything, during the war, they may have declined. This was a time of rationing, of basic foodstuffs sometimes being hard to find or being rationed. We didn't get recovery, really, until 1945, till the war ended and in the subsequent years, until after Roosevelt, who passed away in April of 1945. I like to say, in fact, that the economy finally recovered when FDR didn't. But I don't credit him so much with the recovery from the Depression as I do the following two events. And this will run counter to what your Keynesian professors may have told you. How many of you learned in school that when government spends more, it stimulates somehow, magically? When they spend it, it stimulates. But if you did, I don't know, something wrong with us. We can't really stimulate the economy. But when government spends less, it's supposed to hurt the economy. Well, what did we get after 1945? The biggest reduction in federal spending in a comparable period in American history, largely through demobilization. Lots of people who were drunk on the Keynesian Kool-Aid thought that, we're going to fall back into depression. Government spending's going down. This freed up resources to be used by private entrepreneurs, to take risks, to make investments, to expand their plants, to build and produce for a consumer market. Resources that otherwise had been diverted and in many cases even squandered by government bureaucracies. That's a big reason for the recovery after the war. Another one is the dramatic reduction in the business income tax rate. It fell, the top rate fell on business income from 90% overnight to 38%. That was signed into law by, rather reluctantly, but it was signed into law by Harriet Tubman. Would that make a difference in your calculations as a business person? If you're thinking, do I dare take a risk, expand my plant, make a new investment, if the government might claim as much as 90% of my earnings? But then the next day, the government says, nope, the most we'll take is 38. That makes some things look more promising, doesn't it? It made a big difference. So I think the Great Depression was really not only not caused by the marketplace, it was caused by the very alleged cure, big government, which didn't solve it either. That finally, when we backed off a sick economy, it largely recovered because of it backed off. Well, those are two of the myths, but I want to give you a taste of the other book too. So let me just say, if you want 50 more progressive myths answered, I hope you'll pick up a copy of Excuse Me, Professor. But John, if you don't mind, I'd like to just give people a taste of the Heroes book. This is important to me. I think it's more important to me than any book I've done to date, because I think it deals with the number one problem in America, which is an erosion of character. And I really believe that if we don't fix this issue, nothing else is going to matter. That so many of the problems we talk about these days are themselves manifestations of lousy character. Look at all the attention we pay to things like the $20 trillion national debt. And we mostly make economic arguments against it, which are powerful. But I don't see it so much as an economic problem, that and so many other things we deal with, as I do manifestations of a character problem. Anybody who goes to Washington and chronically spends more than he's got and borrows to pay the difference and effectively sends the bill to generations he doesn't even know is not just a bad economist. He or she is a person of lousy character. And I think to some degree, so are the people who keep sending them there, who don't demand, in fact, that they stand for the principles we know to be right. And so, how do you teach character? If we're to recover our freedoms and our economy through recovery of character, how do you do that? I think first and foremost, it starts with each and every one of us. You can't preach character if you don't practice it yourself. And you can be a character and not have any. To have character means you are in all things honest and courageous and patient and self-reliant to the extent you can be. Intellectually humble, realizing that as much as you may know, there's still a universe of knowledge out there you don't know. Responsible. And the best way, I think, to teach these things is not by just lecturing about them. I mean, that's important, I suppose, but that can come off too often, especially to young people, as sort of moralizing or condescending, top-down lecturing at them. I think the best way to teach character is to do it through stories of real people. People who have been great exemplars of character. People you can look up to. So you don't have to say this is just some mythical ideal here. There actually are and have been real people who practice the kinds of virtues that make for a free society. So that's the purpose of this new book, Real Heroes. There are 40 chapters in it. And let me just touch on a couple to give you a sample. Within a few years, we will see the first Federal Reserve note with the image on it of a black woman. Now, there's a side of me that says, maybe it's not such a great honor to be on a paper Federal Reserve note, but I think this woman is worth so much more than that. But I think it's a wonderful gesture, and I can't think of very many others who are more deserving. And that woman, of course, is Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman was born in a slave state and lived her first 27 years in slavery. And one consequence of being a slave was a particularly impactful moment when she was struck in the head by her slave master with a metal object. And that left her with decades of occasional migraines and blurry vision and other issues until she finally had it dealt with later. But she finally bolted at the age of 29 from slavery, took that risk, made her way to Pennsylvania. But the great thing about Harriet Tubman was she didn't say, I'm free and that's the end of it, now I can go off and do my thing. She immediately said that her task was to bring as many others as possible to freedom. And she ventured back some 13 times into slave states as one of the most renowned conductors of the Underground Railroad. And she bragged on a couple of occasions later how she never lost a passenger. Because of her efforts, at enormous risk to herself, she brought nearly 100 people out of slavery into freedom. And when she completed this task and the war was over and slavery was abolished, she didn't retire even then. She devoted the rest of her life to various kinds of humanitarian, compassionate, on-the-spot help for others that often characterize a true hero. And I mentioned what happened with that metal object so early in her life. I have to tell you how that ended. It was in the 1890s that Harriet Tubman, in her 70s, decided to have brain surgery to relieve the symptoms from that beating so long before. Now, that's no small undertaking in the 1890s. But to prove to you that this was one tough lady from start to finish, she refused anesthesia. She said to the team of doctors, just give me a bullet to bite down on. And that's all she had. She bit down on the bullet while they operated on her. And not only was the operation successful, she lived another 15 years. It solved the problem. She spoke about the operation often as a public speaker. And I found a quote directly from her where she said, and this is almost verbatim from memory, she said, "Yeah, they took the top of my head off and did something in there and put it back on, and now I feel just fine." One tough lady from the word go. And in the book, there's a great quote I provide you from Frederick Douglass, in which he paid her public tribute. And nobody can top it. So I hope you'll get the book for that one quote alone. So Harriet Tubman's in there. How many have heard of Fanny Crosby? Okay, another great hero. Fanny Crosby, still living 102 years ago. She died in February 1915 at the age of 95, having been born in 1820. Long life. She passed away in 1915 as one of the most revered American women in our history. And yet barely a century later, today, she's unfortunately largely forgotten. Fanny Crosby is remarkable for several reasons. She committed herself to inner city mission work in New York City in the 1870s during a cholera epidemic. Thousands fled the city, but Fanny Crosby stayed behind to minister to the sick and to help treat them. She contracted cholera herself, but eventually recovered. If she had done nothing else in her life, she'd be certainly worth a footnote for what she did in the 1870s in New York. But she also was the first woman to address the United States Congress. She was also, to this day, as far as we know, the person who came to know more American presidents than probably any other man or woman in our history. How many of you have known, say, 5 American presidents? That'd be quite a feat, huh? Well, we've had 44. How many would you guess Fanny Crosby, as the record holder, came to know? Some after they were president, but nonetheless while they were still alive. 21. She knew 21 presidents, every one from John Quincy Adams, who, by the way, was elected to Congress and served for 17 years as a congressman from Massachusetts after he was president. It was during that time that Fanny Crosby met him. She was sought after by men and women of great influence and notoriety and power. She also holds the record for having written the lyrics to more songs than any other person ever in human history. In her case, mostly they were hymns. She wrote almost 9,000 hymns. And I'll bet a lot of you have sung some of them, like Blessed Assurance, To God Be the Glory, still sung widely in churches today all over the world. When she was nearly 90, she gave an address before 5,000 people in Carnegie Hall in New York City after the people there sang Fanny Crosby hymns for nearly an hour. She was given all kinds of awards for her lifetime of grace and dignity and productivity and just being such a fine individual. But I didn't tell you the most important thing about her. She was completely blind from the age of 6 months, never saw a thing. Never saw a thing. And she would many times be asked about this incredible handicap. How do you handle it? How could you do the things you do and never having seen a thing? And she would always use the opportunity to express her gratitude to her Creator because she felt this was a blessing. She even said on more than one occasion how she, if I can get it precise, it's in the book, how she thinks she wouldn't have been as fine a person if she'd been able to see, and that being deprived of sight actually cultivated some virtues in her that she might not otherwise have ever seen the value of. That's optimism, isn't it? For a person to take what little he or she may have and be grateful for it and decide, as she said to Congress when she spoke to it, to be all that she could be with whatever she had and be the best example she could be for others. So she's a chapter in the book because I think strongly that she should not be forgotten. She's an American great. Now, on time, shall I give one more or do we go to questions?
It's up to you. We have about 10 minutes. We love question and answer.
Oh, you mean 10 minutes total, even if we take questions?
Right.
Oh, well then I'll only give you one quick one and make it very quick, but only because there's a Kansas connection. How many of you have heard of Prudence Crandall? Okay, she's a chapter in the book. This remarkable woman started out in Connecticut. She ended up settling in Kansas for decades before she passed away. In the 1830s, she was a young lady right out of school hoping to become a teacher. And so she started a school for young ladies in Canterbury, Connecticut. And things were going great. She was recognized as a phenomenal teacher, and people in town were sending their daughters there. They loved the school. She received a number of awards and recognitions. But then, this is in the 1830s, a young free black girl, daughter of free blacks in the town, a young lady of great repute. She was loved in the community, never any problem with her. She came to Prudence's school and said, I would like to enroll, and my parents are able to pay the tuition. Prudence Crandall immediately recognized that this would not sit well with some people in the community. But she didn't hesitate. She accepted this young lady, and sure enough, you think of racism as something of the Deep South, not in those days. It was everywhere, and not just in the US. It was a worldwide phenomenon. Immediately, those who had been praising her said, this is an outrage. They began withdrawing their daughters from the school because Prudence had accepted this one young black girl. And it threatened the financial viability of the school. There were threats against the school as well. And most people might have said, look, I just can't handle this, and why risk the whole enterprise? So I'm going to have to let this young lady go. Prudence Crandall said this was wrong. She was not going to tolerate this kind of abuse. She would not expel this young girl named Sarah. And in fact, it got to the point where so many of the white folks had taken their daughters out, Prudence made the decision. She would create a new school, and it would teach exclusively young black ladies. She got William Lloyd Garrison, the great abolitionist, the editor of the Liberator, involved. And he said, I will help there are free black families all over New England who would love to have a place to send their young girls to school. And I will help get them and tell them about your school so that they send them and pay the tuition and you can keep it open. Well, and that began to happen. Her numbers swelled as young black ladies from all over New England came. Well, guess what the Connecticut legislature did? They actually passed a law called the Black Law that made it illegal for blacks to come from other states to be educated in Connecticut, aimed specifically at this school. Prudence Crandall faced a new crisis, not only this law, but also all manner of harassment, the poisoning of the well, which caused her to go fetch water herself for her own school, and so forth. Well, finally, she had no choice but to give up on it because she saw that the place was set on fire more than once. She saw the lives of her students in danger and had to leave the state of Connecticut. But she settled in Kansas, where she spent the rest of her life, another 50 years or so. The school that she started in Connecticut is still there. It's the Prudence Crandall Museum to this day, which tells her story. And ultimately, the state of Connecticut did some penance for this. It not only repealed the Black Law, but late in her life, it approved an appropriation for Prudence Crandall to compensate her, at least in part, for her stand against prejudice. It's people like that that we have forgotten in America that we need to dust off and celebrate how far we've come as a people. So far that we are still the envy of the world to those who understand the importance of what America's message is ultimately all about. So with that, I'll be happy to take a few questions, and thank you for your attentiveness. Thank you.
Love what Trump plans to do. I believe the corporate tax, lower it from that excessive 38 to 35, take it down to 13, 15 like Europe does, and bring those $3.5 trillion back. He thinks maybe $5 trillion. In your estimation, sir, would that really help with the economy, and would you have to force these corporations to, if they bring it back at that low tax rate, to actually invest building up with it?
Well, any reduction in the corporate income tax will be a big help. It's already the highest among our major Western trading partners. It's a serious impediment to American competitiveness. So I applaud bringing that rate down. But the idea of then saying, but if we let you keep what's yours in the first place, you then have to concede to us when we tell you where you're going to go, where you're going to be, and what you're going to do with it, is to me very un-American. So no, I would cut the tax rate and let her rip, and they will do as they have always done. When American enterprise becomes profitable to invest in, when government takes less of the rewards from that, you don't have to tell them to do it, they will do it.
I'm going to move over here to John Todd for a question.
Mm-hmm.
Since we're in a presidential year, would you share with us your favorite president?
Oh, okay. Well, it's not the current one. I remember hearing a guy named Tom Anderson once. This was before President Reagan, who I greatly admire, but he was describing several presidents in a row, and he said, Franklin Roosevelt proved a man could be president a lifetime. Harriet Tubman proved that any man could be president. Dwight Eisenhower proved that we really didn't need one, and every president since has proven that it's dangerous to have one. But my favorite, though, is Grover Cleveland, and he's not a chapter, unfortunately, in the book. Maybe the next one. But I have written a lot about him, and if you just type in his name at fee.org, you'll find a lot of my and other people's material on Grover Cleveland. He was for all the right things: small government, lower taxes, free trade, free enterprise. He was against the welfare state, vetoed more bills than all the previous 21 presidents combined. And one of those bills, he vetoed an appropriation for federal aid to drought-stricken farmers in Texas. And in that veto message, he famously said, I can get it, I think, word for word. He said, I can find no warrant in the Constitution for the appropriation of public monies for the relief of private distress. Imagine that. I swore to uphold the Constitution. It doesn't say we can do this. How refreshing. And then he goes on to say, though the people may support the government, it's not the duty of the government to support the people. And in the very next paragraph, he says, the charity of our fellow countrymen must be relied upon in times of distress, lest we travel the path to paternalism and dependency. How prophetic. And he was a Democrat president. Imagine that. But he was one of our best.
Back here.
When it comes to like the Federal Reserve and the currency and stuff, do you feel we need another situation like Andrew Jackson with the second central bank? And then your thoughts on?
I'm no friend of the Fed. In fact, I can hardly think of another federal agency that's more fully failed its charge than this one. When you think back to the last century, the things that we said, okay, this is your job. Okay, and we bought into the notion that with them in charge, these things will happen. They were to protect the integrity of the currency. It's worth a nickel of what it was when they started. They're going to iron out the business cycle. They gave us a Great Depression and 9 or 10 recessions. And they were to promote full employment. We've had some of our highest rates of unemployment during their tenure, and on and on and on. I think real monetary reform would require a cessation of the Fed. But the question we should be asking ourselves is not how or what body of government appointees should we have in charge of our money, but rather how do we once again put market forces in charge of the production and the supply of our money? We'd be doing that or asking that if, let's say, we had 100 years of the government in charge of the green bean supply. 7 people appointed by the president on the green bean board to determine, buy and sell green bean bonds and determine what the supply of green beans would be. We'd be shaking our heads saying, how did we ever fall for that? And we wouldn't be asking, what new body of politicians must we appoint to fix this? We'd be saying, how do we put the market back in charge of green beans? That's another subject, big one, but I think the sooner we can get an Andrew Jackson type who will end the Fed, the better.
Okay, right there.
Are you concerned about Donald Trump's advocate of tariffs as like smooth Holly for this country too?
Yeah, absolutely I am. I think on that he's dead wrong. I don't know whether he's not knowledgeable of that aspect of the past or of economics or why, but it's certainly resonating with a lot of people on the campaign trail. But not only would it be unwise to be jacking up tariffs, what really bothers me is how he makes these statements that this is not a brief for Hillary Clinton, believe me, but he makes these statements that businesses, we're not going to let them go to Mexico. We're going to tell them where they should be. And I'm thinking, but this is America. This is not North Korea. The president does not tell private business people where they want to build a plant. So what they ought to be saying to him is, buzz off. It's none of your damn business. So no, that bothers me very much. That's very authoritarian. He has no business making statements like that as president of the United States.